African Americans considered the passing of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments true gains in their quest for equal rights in America. However, they soon realized that the white supremacist mindset would not go away easily. Southern governments began instituting segregated first-class railroad cars for African Americans in 1881, which marked the beginning of what are now known as Jim Crow laws. These laws were validated by the federal government in the Plessy versus Ferguson decision of 1896. This decision held that the practice of separate but equal accommodations was a reasonable solution to prevent the mingling of the races. It held that the 14th Amendment was never intended to abolish distinction based on color or to enforce social as opposed to political equality.
Jim Crow segregation is racial segregation in the South. It is the segregation that we think of that has the separate facilities, separate schools, separate churches, separate everything. It culminates, the establishment of Jim Crow segregation culminates or climaxes in 1896 with the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. But by that time, you've already had the establishment of Jim Crow segregation in the South. Separate railroad cars. Ida B. Wells asked to give up a seat, or forced to ask first and then eventually forced to give up a seat and thrown off a railroad car in Tennessee. That's a part of this Jim Crow segregation. Other people, people who had at one time during the Reconstruction period gone to public theaters, sat in open seating in public theaters. Now, by the 1870s, 1880s, and definitely by the 1890s, they are being put in black and white sections of these theaters. So that's Jim Crow segregation. By the end of the 19th century, it was firmly established. Plessy versus Ferguson decision in 1896 does not begin the process. It actually recognizes that the process exists, and the Supreme Court is saying, in effect, it exists and it does not violate 14th Amendment rights. That's the key thing with Plessy versus Ferguson. And then we see ushered in this long period of Southern segregation that continues until the 1950s and 1960s.
Jim Crow is something that was very interesting because all throughout the South, unlike the North, blacks and whites have basically lived integrated lives. Blacks and whites live next to each other. The white families had the black mammy, so that thing. So blacks and whites have always had a high degree of residential integration and also day-to-day integration, more so than blacks in the North. Jim Crow laws was something enacted around 1880 or 1890 where the white Southerner basically said, I need you in the South to do my work for me, but I don't want to see you. So what you had enacted was a whole host of laws, again, to demean African Americans. Separate toilets, separate restrooms, separate entries for public theaters, hotels, things of that nature. A whole host of things to reinforce black inferiority. And over time, as Carter G. Woodson says, this has a psychological effect on black folk because they begin to think that that's the only thing they deserve. They deserve that they don't deserve to go through the front door. That it's okay for them to go to the back door. That they have to tip their hat to a white woman as she's walking down the street. Or they have to step off the sidewalk and let white men pass. In the state of Mississippi, there was a law that said a black man couldn't drive past a white man in his car because the dust from the black man's car would fly up and get in the white man's face. So just a whole host of laws, basically, just to illustrate to African Americans that you are second-class citizens and that you are not worthy of being treated with any sort of respect. Now, many of us look back on that period and say, well, I wish we had it like that now. But very degrading, a very degrading time period. And it wasn't just the physical stuff, but it was everything that went along with Jim Crow. Again, the whole issue of being inferior. So I think Jim Crow was something that, it was in place from about 1890 to 1960 or so. And I think it had a disastrous psychological effect on the African American community.
I think of it as the conditions for African Americans during the NADAR. And again, the NADAR would be, again, 1877 to World War I. And that, because it really is a sort of a compact time period. During the NADAR, we have three Supreme Court decisions that really nullify the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And of course, the 13th Amendment is the amendment that ended slavery. The 14th Amendment is the amendment that gave African Americans citizenship and due process. And the 15th Amendment was the amendment that gave African American males, only African American males, the right to vote. What we have during the NADAR are three Supreme Court decisions that largely go to refute those 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And the first being when the Supreme Court in 1883 overturned the 1875 Civil Rights Law, telling African Americans that they really didn't have rights in this post-Civil War society. Then in 1893, we have a case called Williams versus Mississippi. And Williams versus Mississippi is also called the Grandfather Clause case. What Mississippi had done is try to find a way in which it could disfranchise African Americans without simply saying black men can't vote. It tried to find some way without using color, because the Supreme Court said that indeed color couldn't be used. But if they could find another way, they could possibly do it. So what Mississippi came up with was a policy, or a statement rather, I should say, in which they said that only those people who had voted in 1860, or the descendants of people who had voted in 1860, could still have the franchise. And of course, African Americans were slaves in 1860, and they couldn't vote. And they were able to just franchise them without ever mentioning the word black. And indeed, that grandfather clause is used by lots of southern states to disfranchise African Americans. And the third Supreme Court decision is Plessy versus Ferguson. And Plessy versus Ferguson grew out of a Louisiana railroad case in which the Supreme Court said that indeed if, and that was an important clause, that if institutions were made equal, then African Americans, at the time black people, could be segregated. That the Constitution did not say that black and white people ever had to be together. That black and white people had to go to school together, that they had to ride on the buses together, that time trains and trolley cars, or that they ever had to live together. In fact, the Constitution is very silent on that. And the Supreme Court said that indeed segregation was constitutional. And those three Supreme Court decisions really went a long ways to, again, nullify what had been accomplished during Reconstruction. But again, I want to emphasize that the nullification of those rights really have a huge impact on the burgeoning African American middle class. The African American working class never had the benefit of those things to start with. They're still working along and struggling along as they always had been. But the middle class really, and it's a small middle class, are really very, very threatened. And indeed, it's out of these decisions that the African American middle class, with actually descendants of the white abolitionists, people that have been called the neo-abolitionists, joined together to form the NAACP in a reaction to these kinds of things that are taking place during the NADAR.
I grew up in the segregated South, and segregation was separate waiting rooms, separate bathrooms, separate water fountains. Probably in places like Memphis, where you had a sizable black population and pretty sizable black communities, very stable black communities, in some cases very affluent black communities. Segregation could be, in some ways, made not acceptable but palpable. I guess that's the word I can use. I tell my students that when I was growing up, you had segregated buses, of course, and the idea that people were black sat in the back of the bus. This is, you see that at the Civil Rights Museum. But I lived in an all-black neighborhood for the most part, except for 3 houses where white people lived in this neighborhood. Poor white people, probably. And you could ride from one end of my neighborhood all the way down to downtown to Memphis, downtown to Main Street, and never have to sit in the back of the bus because nobody got on the bus but black people going in that direction. So there was segregation there, but, you know, and we knew where the line was. We knew that, you know, blacks were supposed to sit in the back of the bus, but the back of the bus is wherever the last white person sits. So that's what segregation is. If there are no white people on the bus, then, you know, that's it. Like I say, black people in the South under segregation, I guess you kind of did what people did under slavery. You learned what you had to do to survive, and you taught the same thing to your children. But at the same time, you learned a lot of defiance. African Americans in Memphis were never deprived of the right to vote. They voted all the way through. In other parts of Tennessee, that's not true. If you went outside of Memphis, if you went to Fayette County or Haywood County or somewhere like that, they were deprived of, they did not vote. But in Memphis they did. Now the question is, who did they vote for? Well, you didn't have very many choices. Blacks in Memphis had organized NAACP chapters. You had black colleges here, Lemoyne College. You had strong black neighborhoods, black institutions, businesses, doctors, lawyers. That's all a part of segregation. But it's a different side of it. It kind of says that even though you're segregated, it doesn't mean that you don't survive. It means that you build within these black communities. As segregation becomes stronger, becomes more rigid in the South, well, black communities thrived because you had the growth of black businesses, you had the growth of black institutions, you had the growth of black clubs and organizations. And these clubs and organizations had a great deal of input in terms of community building, social welfare. You had black parks, black playgrounds, all of these things, black movies, movie theaters that showed black movies.
So I think Jim Crow forced the black community to be much tighter. And I think with integration, I think we lost that. I think we lost that sense of community, that sense of togetherness, and that sense of family.
The problem with the idea that segregation was beneficial because it helped us to stay together is that the segregation system was a slave system. And that, I think, is something that a lot of us don't really understand. But it was a slave system. It was a new slave system. You just look at it from the standpoint of the status of black people in 1860 and the status of black people in 1900. It's 40 years separation. And during that 40 years, you had the Civil War, Reconstruction, blacks in the legislature, and all that sort of thing. But the status of most blacks in 1900 was just about the same as the status of most blacks in 1860. And that is, they were working in the country for white folks. And the reason they were working is because they were scared not to work. Not because they wanted to, but because they were the sharecropping system, the system of enforced labor, the chain gangs, and so forth and so on. Most of the black people in 1900 were doing the same thing that most of the black people in 1860 were doing. So what they did with segregation was establish a new slave system. They couldn't call it slavery, and they had to reorganize the way the black population was controlled by utilizing, instead of separating the free blacks from the enslaved blacks in the old system. In the new system, they integrated the leaders, the black leaders, with the black slaves. And so the black leaders did have a little more opportunity, you know, like in my town, Houston. Segregation was very amorphous in terms of what you could do and what you couldn't do. In Houston, at one time in the first 20 years of the 20th century, black people could ride in white cabs. Then Hobart Taylor, who was one of the black leaders, went to the city council and said, look, you're killing the black cabs. Because black people would rather ride in white cabs than black cabs, and why don't you give us a chance? And so the city council passed an ordinance that black people could not ride in white cabs, and Hobart Taylor got rich. And of course, we were more unified because we had to ride in the same cabs with each other. So, you know, I agree that integration is disunifying, but segregation is not the preferred alternative to integration. I would say that nationalism is a much preferable way to achieve the kind of unity that we need rather than segregation. And I would say that segregation and integration are on the same level because they are both white supremacy systems. And they both, see what white people decided, the white people who backed the breakdown of the segregation system and the overthrow of the segregation system, many of them were right here in Chicago after the riot, after the 1919 rebellion. Because what the white people at the University of Chicago realized after that rebellion was that race riots were no longer one-way streets where white people did all the killing and black people did all the getting killed. Because black people, and it not only here in Chicago, but 2 years before that in Houston, 24 white people got killed by a group of black soldiers. And so they were finding out that it wasn't just a one-way ride, it was a war going on. And so they decided they better look at this segregation system, and finally by the 1930s they decided that we had to dismantle this segregation system, because what we're going to wind up with is a black revolution if we don't do it. But what they learned how to do was to preserve white supremacy without segregation. And that's what's going on right now. How do you preserve? You can't preserve, and it's going on in South Africa. What de Klerk and his generation of Boers decided was that if we keep on going the way Verwoerd and the group who set up this system in 1948 want us to go, then we're going to wind up with nothing. So what we better do while we still have some power and some strength is to make a compromise and preserve as much white supremacy as we can. And they have. They preserve quite a bit of white supremacy. I mean, you know, the part of white supremacy that's really important is property, and they preserve that. And so if you look at the situation here, by giving up blatant white supremacy, that white supremacy where they call you nigger and boy and so forth and so on and tell you to get out of here and there and other, to a much more subtle type of white supremacy. And so that's what integration is a very sophisticated type of white supremacy, where they will elevate a few black people and they will stop the more odious practices. But nonetheless, for the masses of black people, the situation is the same, whether you're talking about Chicago or the continent of Africa. The status of blacks in Africa is the same as it was before colonialism was disbanded. Misery.
Clearly, after 1877, we're going to have the NADAR, we're going to have Jim Crow, we're going to have Jim Crow legislation. But it didn't have, first of all, it didn't have to happen that way. C. Vann Woodward, who's just recently passed away, actually, one of the great Southern historians, or perhaps the greatest Southern historian, wrote a wonderful book called The Strange Career of Jim Crow. And in that book, The Strange Career of Jim Crow, he was talking about how segregation came about. The first thing he notes in The Strange Career of Jim Crow is that segregation didn't start in the South. Segregation started in the North. And indeed, segregation is what happened in the North really by the time of the American Revolution and the turn of the 19th century, when slavery when slavery ended in the North. They didn't know what to do with African Americans. They didn't know how to control African Americans. So actually they developed segregation to control African Americans without slavery. Now, in the United States, or in the larger United States, in the South rather, after the end of slavery, the question became, how would African Americans be controlled? And they looked to the North, and they looked to the model of the North, and they adopted segregation from the North and brought it to the South. And C. Van Woodward, in this Strange Career of Jim Crow, talks about all the other alternatives that were tried before people settled into the path that was finally taken. For example, there was an attempt by Southern planters to actually work with their slaves. It was a coalition that's sometimes called the Conservative Coalition. It involved what were called Bourbon Democrats. And these were wealthy planters who felt that they could actually work with their former slaves if they could maintain a property and education qualification for voting. And clearly, and the reason the planters wanted to work with their former slaves is because of the third element that's in the South that really gets talked about at this time period. But those planters wanted to suppress the poor whites. So they were willing to enter into a coalition with their former slaves, to suppress the poor whites. And indeed, when that looked like it might work a little bit, there were always cries of black domination, and that coalition fell apart. Then there was a liberal coalition, and these were, in quotes, progressive whites for the time period, who generally wanted to work with African Americans on an equal basis, and that went nowhere. Because, again, cries of black domination. But the third alternative really did have some sustenance to it. And the third alternative is really the populist. And the populists were a coalition of black and white farmers, mainly southern and midwestern and western farmers, who really came together who tried to come together in an attempt to take control away from the eastern banks and the eastern railroads, who they felt were destroying their agriculture. And indeed, the populists are very successful. They elect governors, they elect members of Congress, they elect local state representatives. But in 1896, that old cry of black domination comes up, and black people are basically kicked out of the coalition, and the populists moved to a white supremacy stance. By that time, what had happened is that indeed the whole nation had moved to white supremacy. And it was a process that, it's really sort of hard to describe. It was a process that really took over the entire country. Again, every institution came to support it. We could start with the schools, for example. What was happening there was, let me start with the sciences. What was starting there basically was, and these notions were also coming from Europe, not just the United States, but there were notions of white supremacy, that white people were genetically, it was a new science, a new incorrect science, I should say, but people were looking into genetics and felt that African Americans were genetically inferior, that white people were physically and mentally superior. So that science models were set up on that premise. And people believed this notion that science was objective, so therefore it had to be true. And African Americans who weren't allowed to even be scientists, so they couldn't challenge this model, it really came to be accepted. Once that was set into place, it really is used in lots of other kinds of ways. Historians, for example, at this time, one of the greatest American historians of all time, U.B. Phillips, he wrote this book called American Negro Slavery. And in this book, American Negro Slavery, he talks about how the slaves, the happy darkies, were singing when they would come in from the fields, how they would sing for the master, and how things were nice and pleasant, and they loved to be out in the cotton fields, working for the master, happy to be working for the master, and people really believed it. And that was history. I mean, it wasn't as if there was even a contrary model. That was the truth. That was the fact. And that was the kind of things that were being taught to school children. Africa was the dark continent, the continent of the heathens and the savages. Carter G. Woodson has written a wonderful book that everyone should read. It's called The Miseducation of the Negro. And what he points out in there is that what you have is you have several generations of African Americans who embrace education, because they feel that education is the way to move forward in this progressing world. But when you look at the kinds of things that are being taught in school, so education can be a mix, in that sense can be a mixed bag. Education is good, but you really have to look at what was happening. So that was happening in history, but also sociology, philosophy, the sciences, foreign policy. During this time period, during the Nadar, it was a time period in which the United States felt that indeed it had a white man's burden.
My first 7 years of schooling was in a segregated, well, not all after that was segregated, but I mean was in a one-room school where all 8th grade was taught by one teacher, and she got around, believe it or not, to all of us in one day. And our school term was 6 months, where the whites were 9 months. And that was for agricultural reasons, so that we could work in the field. So our education was cut short. All of our textbooks was always secondhand when we got them. And they used to be riding a bus and we'd be walking, and then they'd pass and use the N-word on us as they would pass. Very, very humiliating. I remember some of the helplessness as a person. Probably hard for you to imagine what cutting timber was like when I was 16. And I worked 2 weeks for a fellow who refused to pay me. And there was nothing I could do but get killed if I had pursued it or tried to make him go. Even the sheriff would have helped him. So I had no recourse. These are the kind of humiliating things that we have experienced through life.